Hey there, my name is ARTFX and welcome back to my channel. Today we're gonna talk about OTT.
No! God, please, no! No!
Again. Before we do that though, I want to thank all of you for helping me out, getting me up to 75,000 subscribers. Thanks a lot, last few months have been going really good, so let's keep this up. Let's dive into the video. So a couple of weeks ago I did a video about OTT. Now to clear something up, in the previous OTT video, and if you haven't seen that one yet, then click the link in the top of the screen right now. I think in the comments on the previous video there were a lot of people who thought that what I meant with the previous video was that OTT is a bad tool and should never be used. That is not the case. I gave a couple of examples. For instance, when you're putting OTT on drums, it is going to smear the transients of the drums most of the time. Now that is always dependent on the content that goes into OTT, of course, so it's not something that you can just say like, oh, it's always going to destroy the transients of whatever you put it on. Now, the other thing I think that I want to clear up is that the misconception I think with the previous video is that people think I would never use OTT, and that is also not true. Now, when I'm doing sound design, phase and all of that is completely disregarded. I don't care about that. When I'm doing sound design, I just want to make cool sounds, and whatever gets me to a cool result doesn't matter. Whatever matters is what that result sounds like. What I see a lot of people do though is using OTT for mixing purposes, and that is where I think the issue sits. Let's say you've designed this kick drum. So this is the kick I've made, and I've also made a bass sound. Now this is just a noise bass that I made in Vital. To mix this right, let's say we have some sidechain. Now I just did this with volume automation. So let's say the noise bass right here, because this is the level, comes in during this section. So here it's at its maximum volume when the kick drum ends. So if I now record the audio on the track above it, you can see how well the kick drum flows into the fundamental frequency of the bass. See? So right here we can see that the kick drum, there is no gap in between the kick and the bass. They perfectly flow into each other. It's almost like it's a continuous waveform. Right here is where that overlap is, where it crossovers into the bass sound. And you can see that this is actually perfectly aligned. Now, I'm going to put OTT on this bass, and just to demonstrate, I'm going to bring the amount all the way down so that we don't get any compression, and the only thing we get is that frequency split that the OTT is doing under the hood. Now look at what happens when I record the output of this again, and look at the correlation between the kick drum and the bass. Do you now see what has happened? It is not that continuous waveform anymore, and we now have a phase misalignment right here, where the kick drum flows into the bass. So that moment is now shifted off phase, and it's something we probably want to fix, because this will make this particular section sound less powerful, because it's not a continuous waveform. It's going to be very subtle, but those very subtle differences are what matters when you're doing a final mixdown. And if you are already aware of it, then good to you. This video is not for you. But if you aren't, then I think this is a very interesting topic to look at. In this video, I'm going to be showing you how I made a OTT replacement rack with Ableton Live. It uses nothing but stock Ableton effects, and it's zero latency as well. So there's no linear phase happening, and it will do the same compression that OTT does without doing the phase shift. So right here I have an instance of Vital playing a square wave, and we can see that on the oscilloscope. It's a clean square wave, nothing going on to it. I'm going to put OTT on this, so let me turn this OTT on, and I'm going to bring the amount all the way down so that we can really hear what the frequency splitting is doing and not what the compression itself is doing. So now we can see that that waveform has completely changed in terms of how it looks. The fundamental has been shifted different compared to the high frequencies and the mid frequencies, and that creates that sort of like shift in phase that we see in the waveform. Now this is going to be a little bit technical, but to understand how we need to fix that phase shift, we first need to understand how it's actually created. So we need to understand how the bends in OTT and a lot of other multi-band tools are actually done. Now this is a little bit technical, but I'm going to try and explain this. I'm not an expert on DSP coding, by the way, so if I have anything wrong, let me know in the comments. In audio plugins and audio in general, there is considered to be a good compromise to do a frequency split that does the least amount of coloration while also keeping the latency as low as possible. The way to do this is simply by using EQs and by using 24 dB per octave Butterworth filters. Now what that means is most digital filters are capable of doing these filters, and what it really means is it's a filter that doesn't boost or cut anything in terms of the gain around the cutoff frequency. So the cutoff frequency, if we're talking about frequency splitting, is going to be our crossover frequency, and we don't want to either increase the volume at that frequency or decrease it, because that is going to add coloration. Now, most digital filters, like I said, are capable of doing a Butterworth filter by setting the Q value to 0.707. That is the exact value needed on most digital EQs to create a Butterworth filter. EQ8 is actually capable of doing a Butterworth filter. I can turn on a low pass right here, and if I bring this down and leave the default Q value at 0.71, that is as close as possible to a Butterworth filter that Ableton can do. This is now a 12 dB per octave Butterworth low pass filter. So now we want to recreate this on the square wave. So we had that square wave, and if I turn that OTT on without the compression, we get that. That is the phase shift we want to recreate. Let's take an audio effect rack, and I'm going to put that on the same track here with the OTT turned off, and I'm going to create one chain here called low. So that's going to be our low frequencies. Now, EQ3 in Ableton Live, so I was using EQ8, but I'm going to use EQ3 for this one, because EQ3 by default already has that Butterworth filter. It doesn't allow you to change the Q value, so the Q value is basically 0.707 in EQ3. I'm going to mute the midband, and I'm also going to mute the high band, and I'm now also going to turn this to a 24 dB per octave filter, because that is considered to be the one that does the best frequency split with the least amount of coloration. I'm also going to change the crossovers here, so the high crossover is set to 2.5 kilohertz, which if we look at OTT right here, that's exactly the same as the high crossover value here, but the low crossover value in OTT is 88.3 Hz. So let's go in here and let's change this to 88.3 Hz. Let's turn OTT off again. So now I have a low band, and we can also hear that. So we get a sine wave now, or close to a sine wave. Let's duplicate this 2 times. And I'm going to call the second, or the middle band, I'm going to call that mid. And the top one, I'm going to call that high. Now what I want to do is I want to go to the mid band, and instead of enabling the low band right here in EQ3, I want to enable the mid band. And for the high frequencies, I want to do the same, but instead of low, I want to enable the highs. So now we have the square wave split it up into individual frequency bands. And if I play this, we have a low band, we have a mid band, and we have a high band. So if I now play these together, well, would you look at that? That is the exact same look that we had right here. So this is now doing the exact same phase shift that OTT was doing without decompression. So now we need to try out and fix that. So on the midband, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the EQ3, and instead of enabling the midband, I'm going to enable both the low band and the high band. So now if I play the low and high band here in the rack, that is what we get. If I now play just the mid band, we get the exact same. Now what we want to do is we want to subtract this EQ from a dry version of the sound to get the opposite. It's not perfect, but roughly speaking, what we get is that mid band. We can group this EQ3 in another rack, and in that rack, I'm going to create another chain. So this chain, the top one with the EQ3, I'm going to call that EQ phase, because we are going to invert the phase of that one, and I'm going to call this one dry, so that's just a pure square wave. As you can see, no filtering, and this is the high and lows from the EQ3. Now I'm going to take another utility, put that after the EQ3, and I'm going to invert its phase. So now, if I play these two together, we will get just the mid frequencies. And now if I play the entire rack together, look at what happens. This is without our frequency split rack, and this is with. If we go back to OTT, and not use the rack and use OTT without the compression, it's also doing a frequency split. But that is what's happening to the waveform, and if we use this method to do the frequency split, we basically get our same square wave back. Now, to even further demonstrate that this is indeed a perfect frequency split, or I guess perfect is not the best word because it has its own issues, and I'll try and cover those later, but this is a more phase accurate way of frequency splitting, and to further demonstrate that, let's call this rack frequency split, and I'm going to group that rack in another audio effect rack. So I'm going to call this the frequency split chain. I'm going to create another dry chain. So this is just, again, our square wave. This is our square wave, but frequency splitted, which we've already established looks very similar to our original square wave. And I'm going to do the exact same thing. I'm going to phase invert this frequency splitted square wave and then mix it back in with the original not frequency splitted square wave to see what the exact difference between the two is. If we get any sound right now, that is the coloration that the rack, the frequency split rack, is adding. If we don't get any sound at all, we know that it's a perfect frequency split that sums back to exactly what it was before the frequency split happened. So, this is without the rack. And now I'm going to turn the rack on, and on the master track right here, I can reset this volume right here. So as you can see, I resetted this volume. You can see the meter. You can see when I trigger it that the meters here start doing something. And look at this value that says negative infinity. It's playing now, but the value keeps saying negative infinity, and thus we know that this now perfectly cancels itself out. The frequency splitted version of the square wave is still the exact same as the non-frequency splitted version. So now we've established that you can do a frequency split that is more phase accurate, and in certain circumstances that might be a much better option than using OTT. So now my job was to try and combine this with OTT to make a version of OTT that doesn't do that phase shift. So I have the mid band, the high band, and the low band. I'm gonna bring up OTT, so I'm just gonna take an OTT and I'm gonna put it in front of the rack, and I'm gonna mute it just so I can view the settings and see what all the settings are. Let's copy this and let's put it on the low band, and I'm going to enable this one. And what I want to do now is I want to mute the low and the mid band. And the reason is we first need to make sure that we actually completely bypass the frequency splitting in the multiband dynamics OTT device. So by turning the low and the high band off completely, we've basically turned this compressor into a single band compressor as opposed to a multiband compressor. We need to do a couple of things though. The settings for the individual bands are not the same. So what you want to do is go into here, go into time, and copy these values right here. So 47.8 for the attack and 282 milliseconds for the release. So we want to copy those values. 47.8 for the attack, and the release time 282 milliseconds. Then we want to do the same thing for the threshold and the ratios of the upwards compression, which is this one right here. So let's go into here, click this, and we can see for the low band, the value here is we get a ratio of 1 to 4.17, which is the same as the ratio we get here. And the threshold should be set to minus 40.8, which it's not. So let's set this to minus 40.8. So now I want to do the same thing for the downwards compression, which is the one right here, this band. So if I switch to here, we can see that the threshold is set to minus 33.8, which is not the same. So let's do minus 33.8. And we can see that the ratio should be set to 1 over 66.7, which is actually the same. There is one final setting. As you can see, the gain on the low band is set to 10.3 decibels, whereas the gain on the mid band here is set to 5.7 decibels. So let's change this to 10.3. So now we've completely copied the values for the low band on the original OTT to the mid band on the OTT in our rack. So now we want to copy this OTT and let's go to the high band. Let's paste that OTT right there, and we need to do this again. So let's go and look at the high values right here. So we have an attack time of 13.5 milliseconds. So let's change that, 13.5, and the release time is 132. So let's change that as well. Let's go to the ratios and the thresholds, and we can see minus 40.8, which actually corresponds to what we have here, and a ratio of 1 over 4.17, which also corresponds here. Let's go to the other ratio and thresholds right here. We can see minus 35.5 dB. So let's change that, minus 35.5 dB, and we get a ratio of 1 over infinity. So let's just bring this one all the way down. That way we get 1 over infinity, and now we have set up the entire high band. So now all that's left is the mid band. We can just copy the default OTT because we don't need to change any values for this one, and all we have to do is turn off the high and the low band so that all we have left is the mid band. We don't have to change the gain either because that's the value that it should be at. So now, if I turn this OTT off, we are now doing the exact same thing with the OTTs as the original OTT is doing, but we are applying that to our own version of the frequency split. So we're not using the frequency splitting in OTT, which created that phase shift, but instead we are using the frequency splitting that we've made that doesn't do the phase shift. So here we have the original OTT on the square wave, and here we have my version of OTT on the square wave. It sounds very similar. The original one in the original OTT might sound a little bit more powerful right now, but the version that I made is a lot more phase accurate. Now, let me show you my version of the OTT rack. So this is my new OTT rack. In this rack, as you can see, let me open it up, we've got an OTT, and I've called this Pro TT because, hey, we need to give it a funny name. I'm gonna show you the insides of this rack as well, but if you don't feel like making this yourself, you can download this from my Patreon. In this rack, what I've done is I wanted to improve the original OTT in a way that I think is more usable to me as a producer when I'm making music. So the first thing that I wanted to fix is obviously that phase shift, and I wanted to make a stock Ableton rack that was completely zero latency and also more phase accurate than the original OTT. So I started by creating that original OTT rack that I just showed you, and that rack is actually right here. So you can see this rack right here is that OTT rack. Now, in here, I've added a couple of extra things. So one of the things that I added is an input gain. Now that is literally just a utility. Utility with the gain mapped to this macro knob right here. So we have an input gain, and we also have an output gain. So that corresponds to this macro knob right here. Now the final thing that I also wanted to add, I wanted to add some soft clipping at the end of the rack so that you can drive the output gain after heavily compressing the sound into this soft clipping to get extra grit or extra distortion or saturation. So I've added a glue compressor, and instead of using this glue compressor to actually do compression, I brought the range all the way down to 0. That means it's now not capable of doing any compression, and the only thing it's doing is because this soft clip knob here is turned on, it's adding soft clipping whenever we go above 0 decibels. So those three things are what I added initially, and I can bring up the rack now. So in here I have 3 bands. So we have the low band. On the low band we have this low split rack, which basically consists of nothing more than an EQ3 with the low band turned on, set to 48, just like I said before. I've mapped the crossovers to macros, so you can see right here we've got the high crossover and the low crossover, and those correspond to all the EQs in this rack. So if I want to change the crossover for all the bands together, I can do that with these macro knobs right here. I've also mapped the gain on the OTT, so in here you can see we have a low split rack, so that is doing the frequency split, and after that is the OTT. And then in OTT I've mapped the output gain of the band to this macro right here, and I've done that for the low, mid and high separately. So we've got separate gain controls for the individual bands, combined with the input and output gain that we already had. So then I also done the same with the amount on the OTT. So you can see right here we have an amount. Now the amount is not a dry wet, just to get that straight. It doesn't mix from a fully compressed wet signal to a fully dry signal. What the amount actually does is when we bring the amount down, it's actually reducing the ratios of the compressors, and thus we get less aggressive compression the further we bring the amount down. And when the amount is all the way at 0%, that means the ratio is set to exactly 1/1, which equals getting no compression. So that is what the amount is actually doing. So I've mapped this knob not just to one macro knob. I've actually split this up so that we now have a separate amount for the low band, a separate amount for the mid band, and a separate amount for the high band. A lot of times I might just want to have heavy compression on the high frequencies and not get anything on the low and mid frequencies. Or maybe I want to leave the low frequencies clean because that's where the sub frequency sits, and I want to just add compression to the mids and to the high frequencies. This way you can do that, but with the original OTT, that amount control controls the amount for all three bands at the same time. So by doing this, we now have more control over the individual bands, which I think is a better way of doing this. So finally, I've also mapped all the time controls to one macro knob so that we can adjust the timings of the individual compressors all at once. So that is basically the entire OTT rack. So if you want to recreate that, then that is how you do it. So right here I have this sound, which is like an 808 kick drum, bass sound, whatever. And let's say we want to OTT that. Now I can put that regular OTT rack that I made on here, but you can hear it is heavily compressing it and it's starting to distort a little bit, but there isn't really any content for the OTT to bring up. There is no reverb tails, there's no noise, and thus it doesn't bring up any of those artifacts that people most of the time use OTT for. So I made another version of this rack, which is the ARTFX Pro OTT Advanced, which if we look at the title here, you can see it's not a zero latency. As you can see right here, ZL, that stands for zero latency, and this phase thing means that it's phase accurate. So we can see that the ARTFX Pro OTT Advanced is phase accurate but not zero latency. If you look at the bottom left right here, when I hover over this rack, you can see the original one latency says 0 samples, so that's no latency at all. If I hover over the other one, you can see it adds 5 milliseconds of latency, and that is because of the built-in noise generator. So what this one is doing is it's adding a little bit of reverb and a little bit of noise in front of the heavy compression on the high frequencies, so that that OTT compressor, that heavy multiband compressor, is going to bring up that noise and that reverb tail in case you don't have it in the sound you put OTT on. So that original sound that I had, which sounded like that 808 kind of bass kind of thing, it doesn't have any high frequencies. There's nothing for the OTT to really bring up. So if I want to use OTT on this, it might be wise to add some reverb. So I can bring the reverb mix in like this, and you can hear that it kind of adds a little bit of reverb. I can bring the time up and the size down maybe, and we can start hearing that there's reverb now being brought up by the compression. We can also mix in some of that noise. And that way we can turn an 808 sub into a noise base really easily just by using this Pro OTT rack. And I can show you the insides of that rack. It's very similar to the other one. You can see right here we've got the input gain device, we've got the output gain device, and we've got the soft clipping, and in between the input gain and the output gain device we've got the OTT Advanced rack, and that contains the low band with the split again and the OTT, just like the other rack. And then on here we've got the mid band with the mid split using the phase inversion method, and then we've got the OTT behind that. And then we have the high band, and on the high band, this is where the special thing happens. We've got a noise generator in front of the frequency split. I'm not sure why, but if I put this one after the frequency split, it's not adding any noise. I don't know why. I've tried this out and I haven't figured out why it's not doing it, but see? We don't get any noise if I put it after the frequency split. But if I put it in front of the frequency split, it adds noise. It's very weird. I'm not sure why that's doing that, but just forget that. If you know why, by the way, let me know in the comments, because I'm really trying to figure out why that happens. But basically, if we add it in front of the frequency split rack, it adds the noise, so I've opted to do that. The amount is mapped to a macro knob, and then the frequency as well, so I can also change the frequency of the noise like that. Now this erosion, because that's what it is, it's basically just an erosion device, this one adds 5 milliseconds of latency, so this is the only reason why this rack is not zero latency. After the frequency split, we have this reverb. Now I opted to use the new reverb, the hybrid reverb from Ableton Live 11, because this one is zero latency. The original reverb in Ableton is not. It adds a little bit of latency, and because the noise was already adding some latency, I didn't want to add even more. I decided to use the hybrid reverb instead. And this one, again, dry wet is mapped to a macro knob right here. That's the reverb mix. And then we have the size and the decay mapped to these knobs right here. So that's basically the only little extra that I did for the advanced version of this rack. So you can now recreate these racks, as I said. If you don't feel like doing that, or if you're not as advanced on creating racks like this, then you can go to my Patreon, patreon.com/ARTFX, and on there you will be able to download this particular Pro TT rack, the original ARTFX Pro TT and the ARTFX Pro TT Advanced. They will both be available through my Patreon. But I will have 4 additional racks on my Patreon as well, which are going to be frequency split racks. I decided to include the 2-band frequency split rack that is not using the phase inversion. So this is the one that is going to alter the phase, but it is zero latency as well. Now in this rack, what I've done is I haven't used EQ3, but I've used EQ8. And the reason why is because I wanted to give you control over the slope, the steepness of this curve. So here we have 2 macro controls. One of them controls the crossover frequency between the bands, and the other one controls the steepness of the curve. So you can see by changing this, you can change how steep these curves are and how aggressive it cuts the bands. So this is a 2-band frequency split. Then I have another version of that, which is the same one, but this one is phase accurate. So this one uses the phase inversion method. As you can see right here, it has the EQ with the inverted utility, the phase inverted utility behind it. So this one does the exact same as the previous one, but does it while retaining the phase. So again, we've got a crossover here, and then we've got the slope control, which controls the steepness of these curves, again, like on the other one. But this one, as I said, is going to be accurate to the phase. Then I have the same thing for a 3-band frequency split. So this one is the same rack, but instead of doing 2 bands, it is 3 bands. So we've got a low, mid, and high. Again, we've got a low crossover and a high crossover, and we've got a low slope and a high slope. So that one, again, this one is zero latency, but it does alter the phase. This is the original way of doing it. And then here I have the same rack, but this time using the phase inversion method. So as you can see from the title, this one is zero latency and phase accurate. So if you want to do a phase accurate frequency split, you can use this version of the rack. And again, we've got a low crossover, high crossover, and a low slope and a high slope. So that's pretty much it. Now, one final thing, I think I should demonstrate real quickly some of the issues that this rack has and what it sounds like, I guess, as well. So let's first start by putting OTT Advanced on my drum break right here. So what does it do to drums? Here we go. Let's see how much we can affect these drums. Let's start by bringing the time down a bit. Get some really heavy compression. Let's bring the low amount down. So we get our clean sub again. Let's bring the low gain down a bit as well, because it's getting a little bit louder. Now we get clean sub. Let's reduce the amount of compression on the mid frequencies. Ooh, I like that. Let's reduce the volume of the mid band a little bit. Ever so slightly. Now, let's play around with the time control again. Ooh. Okay. Now that sounds pretty fucking decent. So, this is before. And this is after. So we can start hearing it brings up some of the crunchy artifacts in the tails of the sound, but it still retains how sort of like tight the drums sound, and it doesn't completely destroy the transients. Now the final thing is we are losing some volume. So that is why the output gain comes in handy. Now I can bring this output gain up without having to worry about clipping because we have the soft clipper. So I can bring this output gain up, and because we have the soft clipper, I can drive it into that soft clipping, which is going to add some more extra distortion on top of a drum break. So if I do that, you can see we actually can go up quite a bit without, well, without completely destroying the sound. As you can see here right now, this is the version I have now. And this is what we had before. So you can hear we're now doing OTT compression, very heavy compression, but we're still retaining the original transients of the sound. So let me duplicate that so that I can actually freeze this and flatten it and see what this looks like compared to the original waveform. So if I do this, we can now go in here and I can see that it has heavily compressed things. It has heavily brought up some of the frequencies. Like this frequency right here is being heavily clipped because of the soft clipping, but it hasn't shifted that fundamental frequency. This peak right here is still in the exact same spot as where that peak was in the original waveform. We can see right here we have a peak. That peak is still here. We have a little valley right here. We can see that here as well. There are slight differences every now and then, and you will be able to spot maybe somewhere that there is going to be a slight area where it is going to be different in phase than what it was before, but it retains that phase a lot more accurately than what the original OTT does. And to completely demonstrate that one more time, so here we have the difference. Now, you can see the original OTT, it has really shifted this peak right here. You can see where we had a valley before in the waveform or where we had a peak before in the waveform, it's now doing something else. So that is a big difference. You can also see how much it has actually altered the shape of the transient. So the transient right here has become completely different in shape as opposed to what it was here, which is my version of the OTT compared to the original. So you can see this one retains the shape of the transients of these drums a lot more accurately than this version does, which is the original OTT. So that is a very big difference. And when you're using this on drums, for instance, I think phase accuracy is very important. So yeah, keep that in mind and do with this what you want. And if you don't feel like this has any importance at all, then you are free to do that. I'm not saying that you should do what I'm saying you should do. You know, I'm just telling you that there are ways of doing this that will not shift the phase and that will retain that phase a lot better. And yeah, I guess, or I think in some instances that is going to be a better way of doing things. So there is one final issue that I should show you before we actually end the video. I'm going to put Vital again on this last track, because I want to show you one final thing. On this Vital, let's turn off the oscillator, let's turn on the sampler, which is a white noise sample. I'm just going to bring this down a bit so that we're not going to hurt our ears. So I'm going to go to my master, because there I have a frequency analyzer. I'm going to just open this one up, do this, and let's go back to the Vital track, and let's put this OTT rec that I made on this Vital track. So I'm just going to take the original one, not the advanced one, but the original one. So here we have our white noise. I can capture that frequency curve by doing this. So now we have the frequency curve of a white noise visible right here. Now I'm going to put on the OTT rack. And we can already see a change that is happening right now. So let's capture that as well. So we can already see that change. So it is bringing up the low frequencies quite a bit. And that is, of course, the heavy compression that's doing that. It's also creating a slight boost around here, which is kind of happening because of, I guess, the overlap between the filters. And it's reducing the high frequencies a little bit, which I think is actually a result of the heavy compression. So that is actually pretty good. It retains that frequency curve quite a bit, even though we're doing very heavy compression on the sound. Now, the issue is, though, when you start altering the gain of the individual bands. So let's say I bring the mid gain down to, for instance, 5 decibels. Now, if I play this sound, look at what happens on this frequency analyzer, and look at what happens to the frequencies around this area right here. So by reducing the mid gain, we've actually brought that curve of the frequencies back to what it originally was. So that's actually very good. That's really nice. Now, I wonder what happens if we start playing around with the crossover, because there are going to be parts of the spectrum where we get some issues. Let me try and show you. So here I have the now different version. If I bring the crossover up and the gains of the individual bands are different, it will at some parts of the frequency spectrum, depending on where you set the crossover, create a slight dip in frequencies and maybe a slight boost above it or below it, depends on where you set it. But you can see that it does create that slight sort of like dip in frequencies here. Now if I bring the gain up again to 10.3, which is the same as the low and high band, this dip should be gone. So if I now play this, you can see we've removed that dip again. So that is an issue with this rack. Now, is this an issue? It can be an issue. It doesn't necessarily have to be an issue as long as you are aware of it. Just as like the original phase shift with OTT is not necessarily an issue if you are aware of it and know how to work your way around it. So that's also why this video is made. You know, it's about making you aware of this. And if you are aware of that, I guess this video wasn't for you. So that's gonna be it though. I hope you enjoyed this. That is the little bit of shortcomings with this rack. I'm trying to get rid of that. If I can find out a way to make this rack even better without using third-party plugins, then I will probably do a follow-up video to this, and I will probably update the racks on my Patreon as well in the future. But if you know about a way to make this rack even better, then please leave a comment below and let me know in the comments. Now, if you have any questions about this rack or how to make it, or if you're having some issues, you can go to the comments as well, post a comment and let me know what your problem is, or join my Discord server. Link to my Discord is in the description below this video. Ask your questions there if you have any issues and I might be able to help you, or if you just don't want to build this rack yourself and all you want is just use this rack, you can go to my Patreon, which is patreon.com/ARTFX, and there you can actually download the presets made in this video. Plus you will also be able to download a lot of other things, including Vital presets. I'll be doing Vital wavetables soon, and just in general I'll be uploading a lot more stuff to my Patreon in the coming times. So that's gonna be it for this video. It was a bit of a technical and a bit of a longer one, so that was gonna be it for this video, and I hope to see you guys again soon. Peace.